Shahin, you're talking about the technology as a challenge. Can you please elaborate on that?
Sure thing. I think what I was saying about technology is that one of the mistakes that organizations make is rely on technology for their ABM program, right? And
Hmm.
what happens is they would say, "Hey, we want to do ABM," and they would go out there and buy a piece of technology for their ABM program, and that
Hmm.
tends to dictate what they're going to do as part of ABM. That's very
Hmm.
dangerous because now your ABM strategy is dictated by what the tech can do and not what
Sure.
you should be doing, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think the better approach is to do ABM without any tech, do one or two programs, and then
Hmm.
drip feed tech into that so that you
Hmm.
automate and scale and do certain pieces, be able to do certain pieces faster and better across a larger number of accounts, but never start with the tech. That's what I would say is
Makes sense.
probably
Understood.
the three challenges I can think of on the go.
Sure. Sure. On the personalization front, are you saying they need to start uh, broadly and not go too narrow at the beginning of the program? Is that what you're trying to get at? Or
No, you see about the personalization actually very closely ties into the myth conversation that we were having, right?
that's right. Yeah.
Because you every level of personalization that you go through, there is a dollar value attached to that. That what I
True.
mean is when you go from, hey, I'm going to personalize on an account level to the individual level, well,
Hmm.
you need to drastically increase your budget. So
Right.
if you don't have resources, and by resources, I mean your own time as a marketer, it could be
Hmm.
resources for your marketing initiative, whatever it is. But if you do
Yep.
not have the resources, you become very overwhelmed very quickly. And
Yeah.
I think marketers who are new to ABM tend to think everything is going to be personalized.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
because they're new, what
Hmm.
does it mean that they're new? It means that yeah, they haven't run ABM before, or the organization
Yeah.
probably hasn't run ABM before.
Yeah.
And when they say ABM, they think personalization, personalization, personalization. What
Hmm.
happens is they over personalize, they overstretch themselves, and before you know it, they're like, ABM is too hard, it's too resource intensive, doesn't make sense for us, right?
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
it also means that ABM isn't defined correctly there. They might be going through the textbook ABM definition, and that might not
Right.
make sense for their organization if they're starting with ABM or their average
Hmm.
contract value is too small. You might have to stay at a higher level of personalization. So
That's
that's
right.
the kind of challenge that I think a lot of organizations who are starting with ABM could have.
Right. Hmm. Hmm. So you work with enterprises as well as like mid-market companies, right? So where do you see ABM programs settling in quicker? What type of organizations?
It really depends how you define settling in. So ABM at large organizations tend to organizations who have average contract value that is larger, ABM tends to be present, right? So you
Hmm. Hmm.
see companies like Fujitsu and Accenture and ServiceNow and so on and so forth. They have very mature ABM programs
Right.
because especially that traditional definition of ABM makes perfect sense for them. It
Yeah.
was designed for that 100 million, 50 million, $500 million deals. So, and these
Right.
organizations are in that space. So ABM becomes a no-brainer in
Hmm.
that context and in those organizations. But in
Right.
terms of younger companies, so
Hmm.
organizations that are, they grew really fast in the past 5 years or 10 years, um, and they've now maybe have hit an enterprise space. Maybe they're 10,000 employees now.
Yeah.
I think in that space, it really depends because there are smaller organizations who
Hmm.
might be 200, 300, 500 employees. They
Right.
tend to move faster. So yes, maybe they don't have as deep of a pocket as a 10,000 person company, but they tend to move faster. There's less bureaucracy. There's a faster speed of adoption. The speed of adoption is
Mm,
faster. Where larger organizations, some, I'm not saying all of them, could be really bogged down with the complexities of ABM, and things would drastically move slower. So
mm,
I think the answer to your question is really it depends. I think anyone who is dealing with complex sales environments should adopt
sure,
ABM, or at least have
right.
ABM as one of their GTMs or one of the motions that they would go to the market. But in terms of who adopts it faster, it really depends on how fluid the organization is, and how not the organizational structure is not flat, but it is free of bureaucracy.
Less bureaucratic, maybe,
That's right.
where you
You
take
move. You,
decisions faster. Yeah,
that's right. And look, there are tons of organizations in the size of like 400 employees that they're extremely bureaucratic and things move slowly as well. But what I'm
mm,
trying to say is,
mm, mm,
you could have a small organization move super fast, and you can
yeah,
have a large organization, an enterprise account, that would move really slow for making
right.
decisions.
It depends on the team's structure and like their thought
That's right.
process in terms of the
That's right. I think
experimentation. Mind. Yeah,
it's mainly dependent on the company culture, rather than saying, "Hey, how is ABM getting adopted?" Excluding those extremely large, again, the IBMs and the Salesforce and the ServiceNows
sure,
of this world.
right.
Excluding those, I think when you come one tier lower, between that, which is again still considered enterprise, and
Yeah,
that mid market, it really depends on the company culture and the team dynamic when it comes to adoption.
correct. That's true. Well, for the smaller companies, right? So the companies that are just about to implement ABM, uh, how do you advise them in terms of the account selection process, right? So how should they, let's say they have a very large TAM, so the ICP is fairly large, running into thousands, for example, right? So how should they get into doing like a one-to-one, one-to-few type of an ABM, right? So where do they start? Like, what's your standard playbook? I know we've talked about how it should not be standard, but you need to start somewhere, right? So what's the starting point, right? So
Hmm.
I'm sure you have some kind of an established process.
Well, if you're a small company or you're starting ABM, I think the first question you got to answer is: Are we doing ABM for acquisition of new logos, acquisition of new accounts, or are we doing this for account expansion? So existing customers, we want to expand
Right.
a customer, right? That's the
Mm.
first thing that you need to decide. For the
Yeah.
the smaller end of scales in terms of the accounts, I think they should not focus on account expansion. Okay. I think account
Mm.
expansion, when
Mm.
you're a smaller company, it can manage really well internally by the existing team. And usually, maybe the founder is involved, and they
Yeah.
are sharper than anybody else in terms of account expansion. So I think it's
Right.
good to think about ABM for account acquisition. And
Mm.
again, saying this with the rule of thumb, with the asterisk being, hey, it all depends. But rule of thumb, I would say don't focus on account expansion, and that means that you roll out one to one. It doesn't make
Mm.
sense. One to one is too risky for a small organization. You
That's right.
basically put your eggs in too few of baskets to run AB to run one to one. So you really want to start thinking about one to few, probably one to few on the larger scale. So again, traditional definition of one to few might be 5 accounts, but you really want to look at maybe in the range of 20, 30, 40 accounts as in a cluster, and then
Mm.
have a one to many definition that maybe you have a pool of 100 accounts or so,
Mm. Mm.
right? And then you approach that. So you're targeting 100 to 150 accounts in each program that you're going after. That would be in terms of your account selection, but also these are all net new accounts, so they're
Yeah.
they're not existing customers. And then you design a
Yeah.
program around that. That's probably the
Right.
best way to start with executing an ABM for a smaller organization, um,
Mm.
where
So
the
how do you
tre-
filter down to the 40 or 50 or at least even 100 accounts, right? So when your list size, for example, is running into thousands, right? So what strategies should they adopt, right? Especially, I'm sure something like the intent can be a filter. I'll bring it down to a handful of or a few hundred companies, but like how do you, like, is there any other strategies that you typically adopt, try to make sure that when you select these accounts, there is a reasonable amount of engagements or confidence that these are the right accounts on which the marketing and sales folks should focus on?
Yeah, so you would sit down with your sales team and define your ICP. It's very simple. Like you don't need to complicate it.
Yep.
And well, in order to prioritize account, you want to and if you have no one to help you out, right?
Hmm.
You do a prioritization matrix. And
Yep.
a
Okay.
prioritization matrix is a set of criteria that accounts will go in and they will get ranked and they get a score. And then you
Hmm.
can objectively look at those accounts and say, this account has a score of 50 compared to this account that has a score of 30. Therefore, I'm going to
Hmm.
focus on this account. So,
Right.
and there are multiple factors that kind of go in your prioritization matrix. Intent data is one, third party intent data could be one. You might look at first party intent data. So, do we have any information internally about these accounts? You might look at size of the organization might be another factor. You might say, hey, if they're between, I don't know, 200 to 400, they get a score of this. If they're between 400 and 1,000, they get a score of this, and so on and so forth. If they have
Hmm.
an IT team that is larger than this, there's a score. If they have multiple locations, that's another factor. If they're
Hmm.
if they're from this vertical, we do really well in this vertical, and we have multiple case studies. That's another factor, right? So you
Hmm. Hmm.
put all those in order to create a prioritization matrix, and you simply just look at the top of the list, right? You're like, okay,
Hmm.
so who
Hmm.
is falling in that, and those are the accounts that we want to go after. Now you want to take it one level further. You maybe don't look at the top of the list. You look at you ignore maybe the first 100 or 150 accounts. You look at the next 150 accounts, because what you don't want to do is you don't want to target your best the accounts that are a perfect fit for you in the very first
Hmm.
ABM campaign that you run, in case you mess
Hmm.
something up. So you look at the
Hmm.
second
Hmm.
tier, and then you run your program, you optimize it, and then you run it for the top tier account. So
Interesting.
keep it really simple. Just look at
Hmm.
your ICP, rank accounts based on that. If you start to see your ICP is too broad, then narrow it down. Define an
Hmm.
ABM ICP
Okay.
for your organization. And that means you're an ICP for your highest value accounts
Hmm.
that can bring the most money into the organization. So
Hmm.
redefine that and make it more granular.
That's great advice.
That's yeah, that's the process I would go through.
Thanks. Well, for somebody who's getting started with their AVM programs, right, so what are some channels, right, they should initially consider? Of course, this is again very contextual. Let's say they don't have a large budget, right? So, what are some low cost channels they should adopt, right? Typically, when we hear about ABM, they start with like cold emailing, right? Anybody who's like sending this sequence based emails, right? So they've extracted from some data source and then they say that I'm doing ABM, right? So obviously it's not, right? But it again goes back to how you define your ABM. It's something that we spoke initially, but on channels, right? Which you've seen it working, where you don't spend a lot of money on apps, for example, right? So do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't think there is any one channel that really defines ABM. I think the more important factor is that if you're running an ABM program, you want to make sure that it's multi-channel, right?
Mm,
So you are actually leveraging three, maybe four channels minimum to put your message in front of somebody. And that
mm,
could be email could be part of it, right? Calls could be
sure.
part of it. LinkedIn could be part of it. Direct mail could be part of it. Your advertising strategy could be part of it. The chat
Yeah.
on your website could be part of it, right? These are all additional channels that you can incorporate. I think the more important factor, rather than thinking about the which channel is going to yield the best result, is how many channels can I incorporate in my program. And the more channels
Mm,
you have, the higher is going to be the success of your program. Again, as you
mm,
said, this is all depends, and what we're talking about here is probably more relevant for net new acquisition of clients
Right. Mm,
rather than client expansion. But I think that is the key. That it has to be
mm,
multi-channel of what you're
right.
doing.
Right. Yeah, sure. I think that the reason for the question is there's a lot of interest awareness from the early stage companies, right? So they don't have an established process. They don't have a full-fledged team that they can actually invest, but they still wanted to get started with an ABM. And like you said, right? So they think take it it's a solver for all the problems that they have, right? It is not. We know that. And hence, if you have a limited team, let's say 3, 4 people, right? So of course, like leveraging agencies, for example, could be one approach they can take. But there are companies, again, they don't have budgets and things like that, right? So they are really working with a very constrained environment, right? And multi-channel in ABM really makes sense, but they have to start somewhere, right? And then question was around what are these some channels, right? If not like 10, but what are the 2, 3 channels that they can start with? And I think you've answered that.
Hmm.
Thank you for that.
The other thing
So
that I would
staying
say
with,
is, sorry, the other thing that I would say is it really depends on your geography.
mm,
So I know email is really hard to make it work in India, but phone
yeah,
calls is really effective.
true.
Um, Phone calls are not that effective in Southeast Asia, but
Mm-hmm.
messages on WhatsApp works really well in ASEAN.
I see.
Um,
Okay.
when you are Japan is another story. In the US,
Mm.
well, nothing really works. It's really tough to kind of crack that the US market because everybody is so heavily prospected to. But and that's where you see the maturity of markets as well, and the fact that multi-channel becomes even more important
Sure.
in those markets. But what I'm
Right.
trying to say is different channels work differently in different
Sure.
markets. And
Mm,
that is another factor that when somebody says, "Hey, we do video LinkedIn outreach and it works amazingly," man,
mm,
like which market are you implementing this? Because
mm,
some
mm,
people
mm,
find it offensive when you send them a. If you send a video in the Japanese market,
mm,
saying that, "Hey, I want to have a meeting with you," it is not necessarily a great look. So
mm. It's a very
it's
sensitive
not,
audience.
well, yeah, it's not perceived as polite, right?
Mm,
So
mm,
so I
mm.
think that is very contextual, and also the culture has a massive impact on it.
Sure. Just want to stay with tech and ABM platforms, right? So, has been your experience with using tech, and what are some significant gaps, right? So that you've observed that somebody just filled it. Are there any thoughts, any specific areas where you think the platforms lack in terms of making sure you're able to scale your ABM programs faster, or like helping teams, especially in your setup, right? So when you have like multiple clients that you're servicing by a single team, right? So I'm sure each of the clients have their own context, right? So there's a lot of context switching that happens, right? So from your perspective, what are some gaps that should be definitely addressed?
Now, I think there's a difference between it should be addressed or it's lacking. I
Mm,
think in the ABM space, probably the thing that lacks the most is reporting, and it's the
mm-hmm,
hardest to do as well. Not necessarily
mm,
because the data is not available. The data is available. I'm sorry, I'm talking about the available data, right? So with the available data,
yep,
you
mm-hmm,
can do reporting, but the
mm,
challenge is every organization is different. We're coming back to this point,
mm,
and
right,
a lot of ABM software is like, hey, here is this template, quote unquote, template that we have for account reporting, and
mm-hmm,
everybody's going to be able to take advantage of this. Well, guess
mm,
what? If that is meant for everybody in complex sales environment where everybody starts to define ABM differently because that's what it makes sense for the organization, reporting would
mm,
have to be different.
mm-hmm,
And that's why I mean that's what I meant, that it's a difference between there's a difference between what's lacking or what is the biggest challenge when it comes to tech, and what is the gap that needs to be filled. I think it's very
Okay.
challenging for that gap to be filled. I know a lot of
Mm,
the organizations that who are a little bit further advanced in their journey, they would bring in a combination of a customer data platform. So that could be, they might store everything in Snowflake and then pull that
mm,
data with Power BI or some sort of
mm.
visualization tool to then get a perfect view of what is happening with their accounts, right? I
Okay.
think that's the challenge, where you have so much personalization that
Mm,
and you need to get a view of your accounts, but the tech out there, it does to a certain degree address the problem, but it doesn't fully address it. And sometimes when you start to
mm,
scale the program, it becomes very challenging.
mm. Are there any challenges in the productivity part of it because of this context switching, especially in a agency kind of a model, right? So I don't know how you guys work, but typically, let's say each of your customers, clients having their own tech, right? And let's say there is a shared team servicing. Are there any specific challenges that comes with it? And then, and do you have any thoughts around how it needs to be addressed?
As in, from an agency perspective, is there any
From
challenges?
yeah, from the agency perspective, in terms of using an ABM platform.
No, I don't, we haven't had a lot of challenges. And I think the main reason for that is they're a competitive bunch, and when somebody develops a feature, the other person will develop a feature, right? And
Mm,
it's not as sophisticated as you would say, oh, it's Marketo versus Pardot, for example. I think the space is not as mature,
mm,
and therefore most of the
right.
platforms are the same. They have the same features, and
Mm,
they have a handful of features. And
right.
by no means, I'm not simplifying the ABM tech, but what I'm trying to say is, what we see is, most of the times you have experience with this platform, you could that experience is transferable to a similar platform as well.
Like using a CRM because it's been around, and then like the core concepts remain the same. I get it.
Okay, so CRM is a different story, right? So
Right.
usage
I'm
of
saying some just
HubSpot.
like an analogy, just like an analogy, right? So if you are a CRM, there's set of entities, and then depending on how it's implemented, so customer means customer, contact means contact, or an account means account, right? So you have that basic sort of entities defined. It's just that how it is like implemented for ease of use and things like that.
To some degree, what I
Yeah.
would
Right.
say is the CRM landscape is extremely mature, right? And I think the CRM
Mm,
landscape
yeah.
is past this phase where you're like, hey, if you're using this CRM, this other CRM is pretty much the same. I don't think that works in the
Mm,
CRM space, but I still think that is applicable in the
I
ABM
get it.
tech landscape.
Sure. Sure. Funny question. On your podcast, Code Colony, right? So it's like you've been running it for over 2 years now. What has been experience and how has it helped you one in your organization as well as your customers, if at all?
Um, I think it's just a platform for us to be able to connect with amazing marketers, but also to share their experience with what is
Mm,
happening in that space. I mean, with Growth Colony,
right.
we're definitely looking at sharing more of our own experience from X Growth,
Mm,
our agency,
right.
and share more of that with the community. But I think that the main thing has been, we learn. We have someone on the podcast, and we ask questions. We learn from them. We share that with the wider audience as well, and
Mm,
that's
mm,
probably the most awesome thing about the podcast.
Completely agree. And I think today is an example of it's a lot of things that I've learned through this conversation. I can do these interactions on LinkedIn, maybe question answer on messages and things like that. I think this is very organic and a lot of things that I've learned. Shahin, thank you so much for taking time and talking to me. So like a bunch of things that I think there is for our audience to learn and implement and be successful. Thank you so much.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for having me, Aaron.